Good morning. My name is Peter Corning, and my talk is a synergy approach to living systems, or the synergism hypothesis. If nothing in biology makes sense. Good morning. My name is Peter Corning, and my talk is a synergy approach to living systems, or the synergism hypothesis. If nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, as the great 20th century biologist Theodosius of Jan famously observed, it's equally true that nothing about the evolution of complexity makes sense except in the light of synergy. Natural selection is a clever and immensely useful concept. It provides a general framework for understanding how life evolved over the past 3.8 billion years or so, and it's probably one of the best known concepts in all of science. However, it does not provide an explanation for biological complexity, one of the most consequential trends in evolution. The arc of biological innovation from primitive one-celled life forms to intricate eukaryotes, multicellular organisms, and finally the emergence of a remarkably intelligent, loquacious biped requires, over the years, there have been many non-Darwinian theories about this important evolutionary trend. Perhaps the earliest was the 18th and early 19th century naturalist Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. A half-century later, the renowned English polymath Herbert Spencer elevated the idea of progress in evolution to an energy-centered universal law of evolution that spanned physics, biology, psychology, sociology, and ethics. Darwin was deeply opposed to such formulations, needless to say, law of development, and he repeated that phrase a couple of other times in the course of his text. However, Darwin never specifically addressed the evolution of complexity as such, nor even more notoriously the origin of species. Many generations of biology students have learned that Darwin was a convinced naturalist. A gradualist, who frequently quoted the popular canon of his day, natura non facit saltum, or nature does not make leaps. Thus, Darwin left it to future generations to explain the evolution of complexity over time. For this reason, many theorists of the post-Darwinian era viewed natural selection theory as unsatisfactory, or at least incomplete, and this resulted in many non-Darwinian theories of complexity. For instance, in the early 20th century, the so-called evolution was advanced by a number of theorists as a way to reconcile Darwin's gradualism with the emergence and appearance of qualitative novelties of various kinds in evolution, and of course, to try to explain the evolution of complexity. However, most of these theorists relied on ultimately a metaphysical teleology and some kind of inherent tendencies. This, of course, was firmly rejected with the rise of the analytical experimental method in biology and the emergence of genetics in the theoretical foundation of evolutionary theory. So during much of the 20th century, a reductionist, gene-centered, incremental approach to evolution prevailed, and complexity was mainly treated as a non-problem or an phenomenon that didn't require any particular special explanation. Evolution was all about the machinations of selfish genes, as Richard Dawkins famously observed in his book, a popular book. With the emergence of complexity theory toward the end of the 20th century, this inspired a new generation of mathematical modeling tools and spawned a new generation of non-Darwinian theories, mainly outside of biology. In my paper, I cite John Holland and also Stuart Kauffman, new flood of non-Darwinian theorists. The problem is that all of these theories can be called reductionist in the sense that they rely on some underlying inherent force, agency, tendency, or law that's said to determine the course of evolution, or at least the evolution of greater complexity, in the course of evolution, or at least the evolution of greater complexity, independently of natural selection. So in effect, these theorists explain away the very thing that needs to be explained, namely the contingent nature of living systems and their fundamentally functional adaptive properties. These theorists often seem oblivious to the inescapable challenges associated with earning a living in the natural environment, what Darwin called the struggle for existence, and they discount the bioeconomics, the costs and benefits of complexity. So life is a contingent phenomenon, and that fundamental fact must drive our understanding of the evolution of complexity as well. However, over the last 2 decades, complexity has finally emerged as a major theme in mainstream evolutionary biology, and is underway for what Daniel McShay, a well-known biologist, has called a grand unifying theory of complexity that's consistent with Darwin's vision. As it happens, such a theory already exists. It seems that in science, as elsewhere in human affairs, there are tides of different kinds, and it seems the tide has finally reached the flood stage for a theory that I first proposed back in 1983 in my book, The Synergism Hypothesis, a Theory of Progressive Evolution. What I call the synergistic, or perhaps bioeconomic theory of complexity, simply stated, cooperative interactions of various kinds, however they may occur, can produce novel combined effects, synergies, with functional advantages that may in turn become causes of differential selection. The focus of the synergism hypothesis then is on the favorable selection of functional wholes of various kinds and the combinations of genes that produce those wholes. In effect, the parts and their genes that are responsible for producing the synergies may become interdependent units of evolutionary change. That's why I like to refer to it as holistic Darwinism. So it's the functional payoffs associated with various synergistic effects in a given context that constitute the underlying cause of cooperative relationships and complex organization in nature. The synergy produced by the whole provides the proximate functional benefits that may differentially favor the survival and reproduction of the parts. So the thesis is that functional synergy is the cause of cooperation and complexity in living systems, not the other way around. If cooperation is the vehicle, synergy is the driver. So to repeat, the synergism hypothesis is in essence an economic theory of emergent complexity, and it applies to both biological and socioeconomic evolution of various kinds, including most notably in humankind. To cite one of my favorite examples of how synergy can play an important role in the evolutionary process, the emperor penguins that inhabit the Antarctic and that need to survive winters where the temperatures can get down to 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. The emperor penguins, sometimes 10 to 20,000 animals, where they are able jointly to reduce their energy expenditures by between 20 and 50%, depending on where they're located in the pack. And they do this by, of course, sharing heat and insulating one another from the cold. And without these synergies, they would not be able to survive in such a harsh environment. The biologists John Maynard Smith and Urs Satmari, in their landmark 1995 book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, came to the same conclusion independently about the causal role of synergy in evolution, although they graciously acknowledged the priority of my 1983 book in their own subsequent book that they published in 1999. They applied their version of the synergism hypothesis, although they didn't actually use that term, specifically to the problem of explaining the emergence of new levels of biological complexity over time. Maynard Smith also proposed the concept of synergistic selection in a 1982 scientific article, and he illustrated with a formal math model that included a term for non-additive benefits. And the idea is similarly expressed in the catchphrase, "the whole is greater than the sum of its parts," which dates back to Aristotle. However, synergistic selection is actually an evolutionary dynamic with much wider scope even than Maynard Smith envisioned in his articles. It includes, among other things, many additive phenomena with combined threshold effects like the famous straw that broke the camel's back, and more important, many qualitative novelties that cannot even be expressed in quantitative terms. Different kinds of selectively relevant synergies in the natural world, including synergies of scale, where more makes a significant difference, the division of labor, the classic division of labor, but I prefer to call it a combination of labor because it's really about cooperation, threshold effects, functional complementarities, cost and risk sharing, information sharing, and animal tool symbiosis, a cooperative relationship between an animal and its tool that can achieve things that would not otherwise be attainable. So synergistic selection focuses our attention on the causal dynamics and the selective consequences when synergistic of various kinds arise and are significant in terms of providing an adaptive advantage. So it's synergy and synergistic selection that has driven the evolution of cooperation and complexity over time, including most especially the major trends in evolution. And the most recent of those major transitions is one that I'd like to just briefly talk about, and that's the evolution of humankind. How do we account for the progressive trend that over time, over 5 or 6 million years perhaps, that resulted in a transformation from small arboreal apes to complex modern technological human societies? Was it a meandering happenstance thing, to borrow a term from the late Stephen Jay Gould, without any particular logic to it, or was there some underlying principle involved? I believe there was an inner logic to the process, and that synergy and synergistic selection were deeply involved in the trajectory of human evolution. In contrast with the various prime mover theories that have advanced over the years to explain human evolution, what I call the self-made man scenario proposes that our remote ancestors gradually assembled a unique synergistic package, a combination enabled our species to gain increasing control over our own destiny to an extent that no other predecessor has been able to do. Our ultimate course was determined by an accumulation of various forms of functional synergy with economic payoffs for the immediate problems of survival and reproduction. The process was propelled by a series of synergistic behavioral inventions that led to, were favored in a process of proximate synergistic selection, or selection, if you will. This is detailed in an entire chapter of my forthcoming book, so I obviously can't go into the details here. But a detailed scenario is provided there. In the truest sense, I would argue the evolution of humankind involved a kind of entrepreneurial process, a pattern of invention and trial and error learning, and the selective retention and cultural transmission of favorable traits, which in turn shaped the subsequent evolution of supportive anatomical changes, played a key role in this transformation. It produced a variety of benefits, all of which were highly advantageous for survival and reproduction. And the accumulation of many of these cultural and biological changes ultimately produced a new package, and a threshold was crossed, and this rather ultimately produced a new package, and a threshold was crossed, and it's rather like the achievement of fully competent flight skills in emerging birds. I think there's a very good analogy there. This package included such things as efficient bipedalism, manipulative hands, large and sophisticated brains, numerous tools and technologies, elaborate patterns of social cooperation, organized collective activities, and a unique capacity to accumulate and use and communicate information. And over time, it also led to larger population numbers, and the larger numbers also played an important role and provided a synergy of scale that was advantageous to our evolution. Furthermore, each of the individual parts supported and strengthened one another. Further changes in our patterns of behavior in our culture. There was a kind of synergy of synergies. For instance, the controlled use of fire actually provided a number of different survival-related benefits, but it also required a greater degree of social interdependency and cooperation among the members of each of the hominin groups. So in effect, we progressively invented ourselves, though obviously there was no premeditated plan. The striking differences between humans and chimpanzees or our Miocene hominin ancestors of 5 to 6 million years ago was a process in which new forms of behavior and new forms of synergy were the pacemakers. I hasten to add that this self-making hypothesis is not as radical as it may be understated or implicit in a number of other theories. Even Darwin himself in The Descent of Man suggested that learned behaviors, including new food procurement strategies, the invention of tools, and new forms of social cooperation, all played a significant part in human evolution. So he himself identified behavioral innovation in human evolution. So he himself identified behavioral innovations. It should also be pointed out that unique among the major transitions in evolution, for the bulk of this multi-million year journey, followed an egalitarian pathway. They lived in functionally integrated cooperative units shaped by synergistic selection, but many of the members were unrelated and reproductively independent. So unlike all of the other major transitions, the reproductive functions did not become specialized, but continued to be distributed among the parts, as it were. Furthermore, it's likely that our ancestors were socially egalitarian as well, assuming that they conformed to the hunter-gatherer societies. So in effect, our ancestral hominins were coalitions of families. The major transition to humankind was also unique in having an evolutionary unit that was culturally based and sustained by a novel information system rather than being genetically based. Well, looking to the future then, it seems to me that there's growing evidence that we're now at an evolutionary tipping point, and that another major transition in evolution is going to be required. It's evident that for all of our past successes over countless generations, we are now at serious risk of failing to fulfill our prime directive to ensure our collective survival and reproduction. An increasing number of modern societies, the social contract is eroding or even breaking down. More serious, the ecological underpinnings for the survival enterprise are being undermined. The twin scourges of global poverty and the widespread social unrest that this creates, and a mindlessly destructive technological system will ultimately compel us to make radical changes one way or another. We would not be the first species to become the victims of our own success. So destined, one way or another, to make another major transition. And to make one that's positive for the human species, that's an attainable goal, but it will not be easy to achieve, to say the least. The collective survival enterprise in humankind has now become a global undertaking, so we have to mobilize ourselves to create what would in effect be a globe-spanning social contract. I see this as the only way forward. A unifying global vision must be at the heart of our next major transition. And like all of the other major transitions that have come before us in evolution, it will involve a new level of organization and cooperation and self-governance that will foster new forms of cooperation, synergy, and synergistic selection. In effect, the self-made man must now evolve into a global superorganism, to use days. The alternative will be growing conflict, social chaos, horrific human suffering, and the wanton self-annihilation of our species on a global scale. And it's important to remember in this context that the danger is greatly amplified by the proliferation of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. In the final reckoning, if our species fails to meet this fundamental challenge that we face going forward, it will squander our evolutionary inheritance and mock the untold generations of our hominin ancestors who struggled to achieve of years. In the long run, either we will survive together or we will go extinct separately. The choice is up to us.